Welcome to the Salon at Tokyo College. Today we are very honored to have Professor ABE Masahiko, who is an expert on American and English literature, but he writes on a vast scope of things. Thank you so much for coming.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
I wonder if we can begin by asking about your PhD dissertation, which I realize was a long time ago. You wrote on Wallace Stevens and the aesthetics of boredom. And I think you do a wonderful close reading using the idea of indexicality, this, and the idea of staring and so on. Yet I wonder though that in reading Stevens, there's a sense in which he's always accentuating sense of ambivalence, even of thisness. Using pronouns are very ambiguous. And more importantly, from my long-time being a long-time fan of Stevens, there's a sense in which he's always trying to do this strange dialectic between imagination and reality, in which there are two components, the vast reading he does, coherent thoughts and so on, but also a sense that there's a much more powerful, incoherent and inchoate ideals, feelings, and so on. There's a wonderful line in, I think, The Man with the Blue Guitar, where he talks about swarm of thoughts, swarms of dreams of inaccessible utopia. And so I wonder if you could comment on the one hand, the realm of ideas and the realm of feelings and sentiments.
I think his ambivalence about the issues you just mentioned is a very important focal point when we talk about Stevens. But we can trace it back to English Romanticism, where we have this ambivalence. We tend to think that romantic poets are always insistent and very confident and very powerful, but actually their powerfulness is always matched with the ambivalence and uncertainty, and their poems are often open-ended. So it often ends with rhetorical questions which can be interpreted as in the opposite sense. And Stevens seems to inherit that sort of ambivalence. But what's different is that he lives in the modern age when he's everything is around him with radio, TV, and aircrafts and everything. So his sense of ambivalence is slightly different compared with the romantic poets after 100 years. So that's one point I focused, and I had this word boredom in my title, which I thought was interesting because in the 18th and 19th century, then the poets were concerned about the negative state of the mind, which was quite often seen as melancholy, but in the modern age it was seen more like boredom rather than melancholy. In the French context it was called ennui, which is both, and which is more cosmetic, not cosmetic, sorry, cosmic. It's more sublime and it's broad-ranging. But in the English context, it was translated as boredom, which involves the idea of irritation and sometimes aggression, not only depressed feeling of, and so on. So he's quite interesting in that sense.
There's another poet you studied under, who I think was your advisor, J.H. Brennan, who's considered even more of a difficult poet.
Yes.
And yet, even or especially in him, being part of Cambridge communism, I mean, he was attracted to Maoism and wrote poems in classical Chinese and so on. So there's, a sense that surface is not quite what presents itself, but there's this dark and brooding ideals and passions, if you will, both intellectual, political, and whatnot. And I wonder if that's part of the secret of modern poetry, this veneer of surface difficulty that hides this boiling, if you will, passion.
Yeah, Prynne is an interesting poet, but he's also difficult.
Yes, of course.
As a person, he's wonderful, but he's also difficult. And he was very friendly to me and very helpful. But I don't think I understand everything about him. He spent some years in China, and I'm not quite sure which. I think I used to know which part.
Yes.
Now
right.
I specifically say which part it was. But he was very encouraging to the Chinese poets, and I think he contributed some poems to the magazine published in China. And he represented these radical poets in Cambridge and Britain. But he was also helpful. He helped some Chinese poets to establish these radical sects of Chinese poetry, and they published some magazines too. But he's also very rigorous. His radicalness is not the kind of laissez-faire, anything goes kind of radicalness. He's very, very particular about details. But to readers, he's almost invincible. It's impossible to paraphrase what he's talking about in his poetry. But when I read Heffer's, his collection of poems first, when I arrived there, I was really shocked because it was electrifying. I knew something is in there, as you say, something down there, which I cannot really verbalize, but I knew that it was there. So I almost thought that I should write a thesis on Jeremy Prien, but I've already decided to do it. Honestly, but it's very difficult to have a supervisor when you are writing on Jeremy Prien. So I carried on with my plan, but Prien is really formidable.
So you
sorry, because I think it might be very interesting if you could tell us a bit about the environment at Cambridge at the time when you studied, and what kind of literary kind of scene was there?
Well, there are many poets who believe themselves they are poets, and there are circles in which they read their own poems. I even joined some of the circles, and one of the poems I wrote was about Wales and Japan kind of things, because at that time there was very strong opposition to Japanese whaling.
Yes, absolutely. yes, I remember.
But anyway, so there was this liberal atmosphere, and unlike Oxford is a mainstream, so they produce poet laureates and editors of the major publishing houses. But in Cambridge, the poets were running second-hand bookshops.
Oh, nice.
And some of the members of the colleges were poets too, and they don't care whether they're established or not. They just read the poems in front of their friends and exchanged comments and so on. So it was like 17th century England, when they circulated manuscripts of their poems among their friends.
There's you've written a great deal on poetry, so if I can go on, which is kind of a introductory book, I suppose, for people who have trouble reading poems. And you begin by saying we should read poems outside of poetry. And yet, when we think about Japan, or when I think about Japan being from outside, there's a kind of a vibrant subculture of haiku writing, tanka writing, there are newspaper contests and so on. And yet, they don't quite enter the province of poetry. That poetry becomes this Western, if you will, almost Western construct, and hence very difficult. And I mean, I could be completely wrong here. But whereas in UK or US, everyone from Shakespeare to the Romantics are constantly evoked, and there's kind of their resonance, even in everyday speech. I don't sense that diffusion, dissemination, penetration of poetry in Japanese life, except for these, waka and tanka and so on.
Okay, yeah. I think you're right. The Japanese free verse is very, as it were, young. It doesn't have a long history. It's sort of invented in Meiji period. Well, it has a history of 100 years, but still, they don't really know where it's going. So I think you're right that they don't really know how to deal with the tradition, and that's why, as you say rightly, the germs of poetry is not really found in our daily lives. Though when we look around and with attention, we sense some kind of poetry going on, and maybe it's more to do with the traditional formal poetry, like as you say, tanka and haiku. But the border is not that clear. So there's something in common among these various kinds of poetry: modern poetry, traditional poetry, classical. Formal poetry. And I had an interesting experience when I taught PEAK students. Do you know PEAK? PEAK is an abbreviation of something which I don't remember. But this is a small course in Komaba where they have students from abroad and they teach courses only in English. So they have international students. Some are originally from Japan, but they speak English in the classroom. And also we take students from other courses, not ordinary, students from in other faculties. And I taught poetry, Japanese poetry, in 1 year. And I asked them to give presentation about anything that sounds poetic in Japanese life. They gave presentation about everything, like kyudo sometimes, and about the music on the platform, trains, and of course games, the computer games, and also what did they have? All sorts of things. They found poetry in all corners of our daily lives, and we found it very interesting because people's life have a lot to do with lyricism, intoxication, dreaming, poetry, etc. And we don't really have to draw lines between writing poetry and living poetry. So there are ways to delve into that sort of areas of our lives, though we don't really have time to do that every day. So I think it's important to do that.
But there's a sense, if I can kind of keep on with my pet idea here, there's a canon of, for example, modern Japanese literature, which you comment on, Natsume Soseki being kind of a Fonse Porego, this colossal figure. And there's a sense in which, whether you look at Natsume, who was of course influenced deeply by English literature, or Morioka, German literature, and so on, the canon is, very Eurocentric in some fundamental way. And there's a kizura, chasm with the past of Japanese literature, Edo Bungaku. So, contemporaries of Soseki, like Koda Rohan or Kawatake Mokuami, they're completely forgotten in many ways. And like haiku and waka, they live on in kabukiza and so on. But in terms of reading, bungaku, they seem to be slightly outside. Just like in music, ongaku is very Western in some way. So Japanese music is different, gagaku.
So you're talking about prose?
Prose now, yes.
Yeah. In terms of prose, when we talk about poetry, the classical poetry is still there in poetry as a genre, and also in the daily lives. But when it comes to prose and fiction, it's heavily reliant on the Western model, because we didn't have the Western style fiction writing in Japan at the time, and it's very technical, how to establish the perspective, how to create a character, the hero or heroine, and other things. So. And the biggest thing was that what we call genbun nichi, the gap between the oral Japanese and written Japanese is so big. So it was almost impossible to write fiction in Japanese in the Meiji period, in the early days of Meiji period. Soseki is one of the writers who tried to invent a new mode, which is an amalgamation of oral Japanese and formal written Japanese. And the formal written Japanese was based on Chinese, and Japanese Chinese, and not the authentic Chinese. Right. But they did, all the novelists did different things. And Soseki admired Shiga Naoya. He was he was superb in having his own ways. no one could really emulate his way of writing. And Soseki and Nakata are known for admiring Shiga. They said that it's impossible to do what he did. That's how they responded. And even now, I don't see any writers who really follow up Shiga. They do their own Genbuichi style even now, but it's changing. And because the oral language changes quite swiftly, because it just disappears. It's quite difficult for written language to follow up, because the written language will stay there, and the gap will get bigger and bigger. So we're always behind. And when it comes to...
If I can push you just a bit, I mean, she and I think in 46 or 47, after the end of World War II, famously said Japanese should start speaking French. But there's a deeper current of that. I mean, there's a famous piece by Akutawara Ryunosuke, Aruho no Issho, Fool's Life, where he has a line, I mean, you don't have to take it very seriously, that my life is not worth a line of Baudelaire. That there's this excessive valorization of the West, whatever that is, and concurrent devaluation of whatever is traditional or Japanese in some way. And that's why I think that whoever inherits the mantle of Kodan Bunka, like Bakin or whoever becomes Jiraiyuki, this kind of literature for old salarymen or something. First, the true pure literature, Junbuku, who becomes this Western construct. And it seems very hard to jostle that hierarchy. I mean, Oe being kind of a prime example.
But do you actually have to have a hierarchy? I mean, in other words, but I mean, there are so many different kinds of genres, and I think the thing is that every genre has its own kind of life and energy, and I don't kind of necessarily see why there should be. I know that Bundan and all that like hierarchies, right? And also academia likes hierarchies. Yes. But in effect, I mean, if you want to kind of have literature to survive in this in this age and into the future, you really have to kind of democratize, right, literature, and so that it becomes it becomes literature for everybody. So I just kind of wonder that the thing that I really like about Japan, for example, is the range of writings, and and it obviously goes back to Edo period and all that sort of thing. But in the Meiji you have the Naniwabushi, and then which goes into the talkie films, and that evolution through kind of popular cultural medium is, I just think it's really fascinating, because it kind of it goes along, it picks up, it's very sensitive to underlying social, cultural, political conditions of the time, and also it picks up technology to the extent, and then it sort of ends up being something sort of quite different, and then it connects to what's that form of singing? Enka, right? So that kind of trajectory I find really interesting, because it is a form that manages to evolve and survive through the ages. So I don't know. I mean, maybe there's just one form of genre of writings in Japan, but I do find that there are very many different kinds of things that exist in Japan, and it's like the kind of base is much more like varied and open. To me, anyway, it seems to me like that. But maybe I'm totally wrong.
Well, I think you're right, and I agree with you. And the literature has to appeal to the public. Otherwise, there's no point in being there, or it's being there. But also, there's always this element of elitism in the context of English literature, maybe Chinese literature and Japanese literature too, because the modern fiction was based on individualism, and they tend to say that this is something only I know, and I'm going to talk about it, and this is I'm privileged as an author to say this. This kind of stance was the basis of some fiction and some poetry. Even in English Romantic poetry, Wordsworth, of course, said that poetry has to be spoken in the ordinary language and it has to be shared by common people. But still, and he has this sense of privileged. Well, he believed himself he's a privileged person. Well, he didn't say that, but we know that he believed himself. He has this philosophical notion no one else seems to know, and he has the right to say that. So the motivation behind talking and writing was this sense of secretiveness and privilege. But also, if you want to appeal to the general public, you have to democratize your writing itself. So there is this ambivalence about elitism and democracy, and in Japan I think that applies. And when people imported Western literature to Japan, people who imported it were elites. The Soseki, of course, was one of the tiny minorities who had the right to go to the Imperial University, and he was like a bureaucrat, one of the top elite. So he thought about the country itself generally, because he believed himself as an elite. So there's always ambivalence.
Could I just bring in this book that you've written, which I absolutely loved, 名作をいじる 落書き式で読む最初の1ページ Yeah, so you might translate it as いじる would be what, touching or playing with?
Touching, but also like teasing and bullying sometimes. But bullying is not a good word.
Famous works, right? And like a doodling form of reading the first page. Would you kind of tell us a bit about this? Because I was just fascinated by your approach to opening up access to literature.
Actually, what I did first was to propose a way to introduce people to books in the bookshops. You can just photocopy one page and write in the page so that you can share your interest with other people. But I think this approach has a long history, maybe back to Francis Bacon. All the footnotes are like this. So you tend to see two levels of reading. One level is just text itself, the original text. But when you actually read it, you consume and you try to understand, and sometimes you don't understand. There's always this dialogic process there. So the process needed to be expressed in some way or other, and writing in is one of the ways. But it's always, it's not usually shared by other people. But if you share it with other people, it will be an interesting, they will follow an interesting course of development after that. And people may disagree with you, and they may want to write in themselves about your comments.
But I thought it was really interesting because, the idea of like you projecting a reader's subjectivity onto the page by in some sense you could even say disfiguring the page. Do you know what I mean? I mean, if you want to look at it in a negative way,
sometimes.
it could be, right? And I thought that sort of interaction that you have with the writer from 100 years ago, like through your kind of your subjective kind of doodling or teasing, and I thought it was really interesting. This you're kind of providing a new kind of space, right? Where the reader and the writer, I mean, the reader is kind of just giving this sort of view, but in fact it is an interactive space, I thought.
So I'm trying to spread this method to students. But there are some technical problems, because everyone does this in the books in the library. That will be a problem.
It won't be a problem.
If you do this on the books you borrowed from someone else, that will be a problem.
Multiple subjectivities, that will be the problem.
So there are some technical problems, but you can take photocopies and just share the photocopy with other people. And you can put it on the table and the students can do it at the same time. I did this in the library in Hibiya once, a workshop. I ran a workshop with people. And I think it worked. And actually just 1 week ago I went to Kumano, and where have you heard of Biblio Battle? This is a game invented by a professor in Kyoto, Ritsumeikan University. You introduce a book in 5 minutes, each person 5 minutes, and 5 people will appear, and the audience will raise their hands after the event which book you most wanted to read. So it's a kind of competition, there's a national competition, but there's preliminary matches in Shingu. It's a little city in Wakayama Prefecture.
Oh yes,
And our faculty has some relationship with Shingu, so I visited the place and I commented on the competition. But at the end of it, I introduced this Masahiko Ejiru so that they can combine the two, because they introduce orally the book in 5 minutes, but if you combine the method, that will be most interesting.
It's a bit like Monty Python.
Yeah.
Trying to summarize first. I wonder if it's possible to go back to novels, and since we're talking about novels anyway, and you talked about the importance of the I or the individual, which of course was taken up in Japan as I novel, Shishousetsu. But there's also a sense in which, great novels, you mentioned George Eliot's Middlemarch as one of the crowning achievements of the 19th century novel, and it's all about relationships in many ways, context and relationships. And yet the trouble, I think, is that it's so long. And at least in the US, I suspect it's no different anywhere else, people don't assign Middlemarch anymore, even in courses on the Victorian novel, simply because it's so long.
900 pages?
900 pages. I mean, it's a wonderful novel, but, you write on slow motion and so on, but we live very much in the fast motion age. People watch movies at 1.5 times the speed. And so I wonder what the possibilities of reading, it's fine to do 1 page, but can they do it for certainly not 900 pages?
No.
Just both in terms of the reading past greats, classics, and trying to.
But there are approaches we can take, and when it comes to Eliot, her writing is really elegant and worth reading closely. So maybe we can divide novels into several sections and focus on some parts 1 week, and maybe we can allow students to skip some sections, because there are parts which are not that exciting all the way through when it comes to George Eliot. But it's important to read these parts, lengthy parts, before you reach the very exciting part. But still, they have a lot of things to do. They have to do computer science and other things, of course. So we need to think about how to approach these great novels. I think George Eliot is one of the best novelists in the world, but still, we don't have time.
I think partially I'm curious that in this age of the smartphone, where people, write tweets, X now, everything is short, everything is fast, everything is superficial. The very kind of presumption of interiority and deep engagement that one presumably needs to kind of keep in mind 900 pages seems to be like an art that's increasingly hard to sustain and perhaps in the process of losing.
Yeah, I think it's a different culture. But we also learn from the transition that we are more, our fear of boredom is really strong. We don't really experience boredom. So all the devices provided for us are anti-boredom. So of course Middlemarch is this huge source of boredom. It's long, time consuming, and of course I think the point of long novels are that they let you experience boredom. Allow you to experience time, the flow of time. And this is important, actually.
Oh yeah, because I mean one of the most memorable novels I read, because of the length actually, was 1,300 pages, and it was written by an Anglo-Indian writer called Vikram Seth, A Suitable Boy, and I just loved it. I just absolutely loved it, because the reason why is basically the story is so engrossing. It's really kind of like a story of families. And by the end of, I think it took me about 4 or 5 days to read this, and I actually read it every day. And I sort of became a member of the family, sitting at the dining table together, because you're kind of living in this incredible space and time. And it was one of the most kind of privileged things I did in my life.
That's interesting, because as you say, you live with the characters. So reading novels means that you live with the novels. It's not something you just focus on, just spending 10 minutes a day.
You sort of go into their world, isn't it?
But maybe one way of doing it is, as you say, read it every day, 30 minutes before you go to bed, or on the train, things like that. But the important thing is that you need to learn to live, and reading is breathing, and you don't use your brain all the way through. Just sort of expose yourself to the world they provide for you. So that's what we need to tell young people. This is what you can experience when you read novels, and which you cannot experience doing other things.
You also write a lot on language learning, English language learning, and wrote a polemic against proposed reforms on English learning in terms of skills. And I mean, if I can summarize, you really emphasize this idea of listening and reading. I mean, if you want to speak, you need to be able to listen, and be able to write, you need to be able to read. And I wonder how well it works. I mean, how much of a resonance does it have with the bureaucrats in the Ministry of Education?
I'm not quite sure, but the people in the office are trying to listen to people in the public. So what we need to do is to speak to general people, because the bureaucrats don't really have their own ideas. I'm not trying to sort of denigrate. They try to listen to people. So what we should try to do is to speak to people, and people still believe that we need to speak English, and we need to, when we visit tourist spots, we want to speak fluently, but they don't spend time speaking English when they are in Japan. It's impossible to acquire any language skills. You don't use the language. So this is really preposterous. They seem to have this. They seem to fancy that. Well, if there is a magical way than the language.
Maybe upload the.
If you just sit in your armchair and ask someone special to teach you English, you can do it in 5 minutes.
But there's a deeper issue, I think, which you touch on here and there, which is the sense that in 21st century, the literary education is just not that important. That, if you want innovation, maybe you should study engineering, science, perhaps even business, but not literature. And so in that kind of instrumental reasoning, it becomes very hard to justify. And so I'm curious to hear you
now
defend.
we are coming to the most important today. So could literature survive? That's one of the topics today, I think.
And also, but could literary studies survive? In particular.
But literary studies will rely on literature.
Yes,
so
of
if
course.
literature survives, the study will survive. And can literature survive? I think it will, and it will easily survive. And that was the main topics of the book. About the paperwork, about administrative process. People tend to stress the difference between literature and other formal writing, other useful writing, which is more practical and useful, while literature is useless, just fanciful, but not true to the fact. But actually, the line is not that clear. What I'd like to suggest is that when we use language, we need to be sensitive to the way the form functions. And this sensitivity to the forms has something in common with our response to literature in general. So when you want to read official statement about contracts, now of course you need to understand the literal meaning, but there's also this implied sense in these writings too, which is the kind of, and if you want to understand what's implied there, you need to have some kind of skills, which is the kind of skills which allow you to read literary works too. So that's one example. But literature and society has a lot in common. Is not really the words. It's something deeper. So we don't really have to worry about literature because it all survives. Right. We love stories without narration, and we have to think. What we have to do is to think about why we talk and why writers write, and the motivation behind it is some kind of. This is what I write in this book, but there's some more benevolence. They want to appeal to people even if they are not paid. That's the starting point. So, and I think that's the starting point of literature too. Even if the books don't sell well, they write.
So there's a sense when I look at my students in US, the will to narration, will to storytelling, I mean, certainly exists, but most people seem to experience it, not so much in the realm of the novel, and not even in terms of long-form television or even movies, but things like video games. You know, that becomes an extended narrative about a character's quest or something like that. And so there's a sense that literature, as we conceive of it, seems to be decline,
probably
lack of
right,
better words. I mean,
but then in 100 years we will start to call this games literature.
Yeah, right.
And that's okay.
But I was also getting back to the more narrow bureaucratic concern. You know, in the U.S., there are many universities that are closing down the humanities departments, foreign languages and literatures, the classics, and so on. And in Japan too, of course, a number of years ago, there was a proposal made of it. So yes, literature will survive in some form, no question. But I wonder humanities education.
Well, the scholars trained in the field of literature will be useful in reading, for instance, the stories in the games, I think. So this may be a transitional period, but I can say that the humanities is useful in producing these kind of people who are good at reading stories in society and other industries too. But I'm not quite sure what will be the case in 50 years or 100 years. We have an aesthetics department in our faculty, and there's a professor who teaches game theory. It's very popular now, and probably this is the kind of field that will be popular in the coming years. But I'm not quite sure this will last. And just as literature is sort of becoming less popular now, game may not be as popular as it is now in 100 years.
But don't you think it's to do with the definition of what is literature?
Yeah.
Right,
I think
that's
you're
at
right,
stake because it's it's been such a kind of, in some sense, narrowly defined field, and if the literary studies field, if literature as a field can sort of expand and open up, and allow for different kinds of manifestations of narratives, because I actually think that whatever the technology is, right? What we're actually looking at, video games or even like a poster, is actually a narrative. Because narrative is absolutely fundamental to human existence. Because you always have to basically make a point about something. Right? And so, history also has quite a lot of narrative in it. And this is why history, I think, whatever people say about it, it's just going to survive, because maybe not as history, but as this much more fundamental form of way human beings, have to articulate themselves.
Yeah.
We always think about how can we best articulate our thoughts, right, to convince the other side. So, okay, this is like really broadening it, but effectively that is what is at the essence, right? It's the core of what, to me, is the attraction of, or if you want to call it literature, maybe there could be another form of calling it, as a discipline, because maybe literature itself is so kind of
narrow.
And there are lots of kind of historical baggage to this term, right? It's such kind of preconceived. There are lots of preconceptions about what literature is, and I think if you kind of manage to, make it kind of into something which is much more kind of vibrant, because that's what it is, really.
And actually, the history of English literature is not that long. In America, probably it was in the 1930s, they started to establish English departments in many universities. Even in England, it was in Scotland in the late 19th century, I think, that they had the first English department. And then in Oxford and Cambridge, it was in the 20th century that they had the department. So it's just 100 years old. And literary theories have very short history too. So it won't be there for long. It may not be there for long, though I believe that the approach of literary theories has had some point, because it's a kind of archaeology of literature, which is very useful, and we can apply it to other genres, the broader genres, and taking this archaeological approach to maybe history and sociology and other genres. And they are all narratives.
Yeah, and it's this sort of archaeology of knowledge, and it's like excavating different layers. You could be a geologist, right? Geologist of literature, because there are all these layers. And I often think about, like, as a historian, I study sometimes empires and stuff like that. And what's really interesting is that in one space, in one place, you have like layers of civilizations and empires, and the where you study is like how far you want to dig in to that layer, the kind of sedimentation of history that exists in a place. So I like that.
So we are hopeful.
We as humanities people.
On that very cheery note, I'd like to thank Professor Abe for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's
Great pleasure.
Thank you.